Story 1. The Barber Who Pickpocketed Poets. You wouldn't expect a barber to be the center of a crime investigation, especially not one who quoted Rilke while lathering a customer's chin. But in the waning light of post-war London, with ration books folded tight in back pockets and lamplight still flickering over cobblestones, a quiet man named Cedric Whitlow became the epicenter of one of the strangest theft sprees the city's literary community had ever seen. Cedric's barbershop, the Gilded Shear, was tucked between a hatter and a used bookstore in Bloomsbury. It smelled of bay rum, tobacco, and ink. Poets came to him like clockwork. He trimmed their beards, listened to their metaphors, and snipped away their silvery curls while they recited unpublished stanzas. None of them noticed when their wallets vanished. Aye, the vanishing verse. The first reported incident came from a man named Albert Dunning, a modest poet with more accolades than money. He had just sold a piece to the London Literary Review and paid Whitlow a visit to mark the occasion. "When I left," Dunning told investigators later, "I swear I had that £5 note folded with my sonnet drafts. I remember because I'd used it as a makeshift paperclip." It was gone by the time he reached Tavistock Square. Strangely, his poems were still in his coat pocket. Only the money had vanished. Dunning thought he'd simply misplaced it. It wasn't until a second poet, then a third, and finally a short story writer all came forward that the pattern began to reveal itself. These weren't just petty thefts. There was a method and elegance to them. Nothing else was ever stolen. No keys. No cufflinks, not even the envelope that held the cash, only the bills themselves. Aye, the inconvenience of artistry. You'd think someone would have noticed, but Whitlow was no ordinary barber. He was careful, respectful, the sort of man who offered clients a complimentary Turkish towel wrap while softly reciting the epigraph from Crime and Punishment. Detective Morris Lillingworth was assigned to the case. A plain man with plain habits, he was unenthusiastic about chasing poets' pocketbooks. But there was pressure from the upper literary echelons, some of whom had close ties to politicians. One Lord Pellingham, a known patron of the arts, had his wallet swiped clean of theater tickets and petty cash after a shave and a monologue. "Make it stop," Pellingham reportedly barked to the constable on duty. "I'd rather be robbed by a banker than a barber." Whitlow, of course, denied everything. IV. The barber's background. Cedric Whitlow had been born in 1903 in Wandsworth to a family of piano tuners. He apprenticed under his uncle at a barbershop before the Great War and was known locally for cutting hair with surgical precision. During the war, he served as a medic notably skilled at stitching wounds in the field. When he returned, he opened his shop and slowly became a fixture in the neighborhood. What few knew was that Cedric was also a failed poet. His early poems, printed under a pseudonym, C.W. Lorne, received minor praise in the small press world but never gained traction. His last published piece was a prose poem titled The Hands That Touch Faces, printed in 1933 in the folding ink. Investigators found no direct criminal past, no debts, no legal troubles. His books were balanced. His taxes were paid. But his clientele, they were being robbed, one poem at a time. Surveillance in silence. Detective Lillingworth decided to initiate an unorthodox plan. He would embed a plainclothes officer within Whitlow's regular customers. The officer, Ronald Bixby, was a struggling playwright with a slight overbite and the perfect air of creative weariness. Bixby visited Whitlow 4 times in the span of 3 weeks. Each time, he carried a marked £5 note, 3 haiku in his coat pocket, and a tiny micro-recorder hidden in the lining of his scarf. The audio captured was uneventful. Whitlow hummed. He clipped. He commented on the decline of enjambment in modern verse. There was no sign of theft. The money remained intact. But Bixby noted something, a peculiar pattern in Whitlow's hand movements. He used a large leather apron with deep pockets, And during the towel wrapped precisely when Bixby's vision was obscured, Whitlow's hands would disappear under the apron momentarily. The gesture was quick, subtle, rhythmic. The breakthrough. A breakthrough came, oddly enough, from a cleaning lady named Hilda, who worked 2 nights a week in the adjacent bookstore. "I thought he were a librarian," she told Lillingworth. "He always came in with his little leather book, put it behind the Wallace anthologies, and left." Lillingworth retrieved the book. Inside, lists. Dozens of them. Names, dates, initials, and strange notations like R. Byron fragment plus 3 quid or AD 5 pound folded in widow's silk. Some entries were underlined. A few were followed by dollar signs. It was a pickpocket ledger, meticulously maintained. Whitlow, it seemed, was cataloging his thefts, or were they collections? Obsession or collection. The deeper Lillingworth dug, the stranger it became. Whitlow appeared not to steal out of desperation, but out of obsession. He wasn't amassing wealth, he was curating moments. Each theft corresponded with a specific poem, author, or literary conversation. He kept the bills in a false wall hidden behind the shaving cream tins. When the police finally obtained a warrant, they discovered over 300 marked notes, each with a sliver of parchment attached, labeled with a quote or line from a client's work. One note read, "To part with currency is to part with metaphor, CWL." Whitlow had built an archive of stolen fragments not for resale or profit, but as an artistic gesture, albeit a criminal one. He saw his thefts as a collaborative process, a shared moment, a silent stanza. Arrest and interrogation. Cedric Whitlow was arrested on a rainy Wednesday in November. He did not resist. In fact, he offered tea to the constables as they entered the shop. When asked if he understood the charges, he replied, "I didn't take anything that wasn't offered. They handed me their vulnerability and verse. I simply held it for a while." During interrogation, he admitted to over 400 thefts but insisted he kept everything. He had sold nothing, spent nothing. It was all, in his words, an archive of borrowed emotion. He showed no remorse. Trial or tragedy. The trial sparked debate in artistic and legal circles alike. Was Cedric Whitlow a thief or a misunderstood artist? Some writers came to his defense, calling the archive a living museum of literary trust. Others were furious, especially those whose funds had quietly disappeared. His lawyer argued diminished responsibility, citing obsessive poetic ideation. The prosecution, however, called it what it was: theft, repeated, intentional, cold. But Whitlow's final words in court left the room silent. "I never stole money, I captured ephemera." Unresolved. Cedric Whitlow was sentenced to 18 months in Wormwood Scrubs prison. He was released after 11 for good behavior. He never reopened the Gilded Shear. Some say he moved to Dorset and opened a used bookstore under a different name. Others claim he vanished entirely. His pickpocket archive. Donated anonymously to the British Library in 1971. But one entry remains troubling. The final note in his ledger, dated 2 days before his arrest, reads, "MH blank page, no words still worth the taking." Who was MH? And what exactly was taken? The ledger left behind. When the authorities first laid eyes on the archive, it was dismissed as mere evidence, a curiosity to be logged, bagged, and placed into storage. But when archivist Eleanor Hastings, a junior staffer at the British Library, opened the boxes delivered under anonymous donation in 1971, she froze. Each item was catalogued with almost obsessive detail. Notes were labeled with the name or initials of the subject, the date of the visit, and a quote, always a quote. Sometimes it was poetry. Sometimes a wry observation whispered during a shave. Sometimes a fragment of a dream spoken aloud under the barber's blade. Many of the quotes had never been published. Alina realized she was holding something that was not just evidence, but perhaps a lost chapter in British literary history. The case of M.H. After Cedric's arrest, Detective Lillingworth had gone back through the ledger with a growing sense of discomfort. The final entry, M.H. blank page, no words, still worth the taking, was unlike the others. There was no quote, no cash amount, no context. There was also no known poet among Cedric's clients with the initials M.H. But a few weeks later, Lillingworth was contacted by a librarian from King's College who had read about the case in a paper. He presented a list of visiting lecturers and literary fellows who'd frequented Bloomsbury in the 1950s. There, buried halfway down the list, was Millicent Hargrave, a little-known poetess and university reader who had lived for just under a year in London before vanishing from public life. She had published only one chapbook, Stillness in Steam, before withdrawing from writing altogether. No one had heard from her in over a decade. The forgotten poet. Millicent Hargrave was once considered a rising star in British poetry circles. Her work was atmospheric, sparse, and often layered with coded references to personal trauma. Yet she never pursued fame. She taught briefly, gave a handful of readings, and then quietly faded from the scene. A retired colleague of hers, Professor Geraldine Witt, recalled something odd. Millicent told me she once met a man who made her feel translucent. That was the word she used. Said he listened too carefully. I wonder if it was him. Police tried to track her down. Her flat in Chelsea had long been vacated. The landlord said she had left one day with nothing but a canvas bag and a suitcase of papers. No forwarding address. No family came asking. She had disappeared without notice, except for that line in Cedric's ledger. Cedric's silence in prison. Lillingworth visited Cedric once after his sentencing. It wasn't standard protocol, but he was gripped by that one nagging mystery. Cedric looked older, thinner, but not regretful. She said nothing, he told Lillingworth, eyes fixed on the gray stone wall. She sat down. I offered to trim her fringe. She nodded. We didn't speak. And then she left. I don't even know why I wrote her name. She didn't give it. I just knew it. That was all he would say. Lillingworth walked out of Wormhood Scrubs feeling no closer to the truth than when the first wallet went missing. The Gilded Shear revisited. After Cedric's release, the shop remained shuttered. The Gilded Shear stood empty for years, its windows papered over with yellowed book pages, the letters on its sign flacking like autumn leaves. But rumors persisted, of people who saw lights inside at night, of a man fitting Cedric's description seen placing envelopes in the bookstore wall again. In 1968, the building was sold and scheduled for demolition to make way for new apartments. During the demolition, workers discovered a second hidden space behind the false wall in the barber's shop. Inside, more envelopes, 17 of them, each labeled only with initials. Inside each envelope was a poem, some typed, some handwritten, some on napkins or receipts. All of them were unpublished. And they were good. Some were exceptional. Experts now believe Whitlow had not just been stealing money, but collecting unpublished work, moments of pure creative vulnerability, still unformed, still raw. Millicent Hargrave's poem was among them. The Hargrave poem. The poem in Millicent's envelope was untitled. It consisted of 8 stanzas, handwritten on the back of a Barber receipt. It read in part, "The scissors hum and hush, a whispered tune of moments clutched beneath the blade's ballet. And in that silence I became a room, too hollowed out to hold the light of day." The final stanza ends, "If he takes the words, perhaps I'll lose the ache. Let him take them all, let the stillness speak." The poem was never published in her lifetime. It now resides in the British Museum's archive of vanished voices, a subsection of the Poetry and Language collection. VII, Ethics of a Thief Curator. As news spread of the discovered poems, literary scholars debated, was Cedric Whitlow a criminal, a voyeur, or a misunderstood custodian of lost genius? Some said he had preserved works that would have otherwise been lost. Others argued he violated a sacred trust, that the act of listening was not permission to possess. A radio program titled The Listener's Theft aired in 1973, sparking a nationwide philosophical debate on creative ownership. What happens when someone steals your unwritten words? Can the act of listening be criminal? Is collecting fragments of lives without permission an art form? VIII, The Investigative Blind Spot. Detective Lillingworth, by now retired, was interviewed for a magazine profile years later. He admitted he had never considered the possibility that Cedric's motive was preservation rather than greed. We kept looking for cash, but he wasn't building wealth. He was building a cathedral of things people said in their most honest moments, a kind of library that no one else was qualified to curate. He paused, then added, still it was theft, however elegant. Where did Cedric go? Following his early release, Cedric Whitlow reportedly changed his name and relocated to Dorset. Rumors suggest he opened a small used bookshop called Quiet Things. Locals described a soft-spoken man who would ask customers to read something aloud if they had the time. A travel writer named Simon Kirk once visited the shop. In an article written decades later, he described the bookseller as having a surgeon's hands and a poet's silences. Kirk bought a collection of Neruda and found, tucked inside the pages, a handwritten note. Some things are only beautiful once taken. The handwriting matched samples from Cedric's court documents. But by the time investigators traced the location, the shop had closed. No forwarding address. Just like Millicent. The story's residue. Years after the case, literary scholars still reference the Whitlow method when discussing the strange interplay between observation and appropriation in writing. Some creative writing courses even use the Ledger Archive to teach ethical listening in nonfiction narratives. And yet, some envelopes from the original archive remain sealed, labeled only with initials and never claimed. One reads simply, "Yours, the envelopes that spoke." When the sealed envelopes from Cedric Whitlow's archive were opened decades later under strict archival procedure, they revealed something deeply unsettling. One envelope contained no poem, no money, not even a note. Just a single lock of gray hair, tied with blue thread. Another held a napkin with the line, "He cuts where language bruises." A third contained an old tram ticket with the initials RL and a scribbled fragment. "Knew the theft would come, but didn't think I'd miss it." These pieces were not simply crimes, nor were they just curiosities. They were mementos of emotional theft. Whitlow hadn't just taken bills or poetry, he'd taken moments. Private, transitory truths exchanged in an intimate space between razor and trust. He had turned his barber shop into a confessional booth, and he became a kind of priest of the unspoken. It wasn't about money, it never had been. The mirror as witness. One of the last objects found during the demolition of the Gilded Shear was an antique mirror, cracked, but still intact. An old customer, playwright Harwin Locke, claimed it wasn't just a mirror. "It was a stage," he said. "That's where we looked ourselves in the eye after he'd taken something, only we didn't know what was missing yet." This mirror, now preserved at the Museum of London's Crimes of Intimacy exhibit, sits behind a pane of glass in a dimly lit room. Visitors have reported strange sensations, feeling watched or spoken to when they stand before it. No one's proven anything supernatural, of course. But those who know the story say that the mirror remembers more than people think. What the trial didn't reveal. At Cedric's trial, many details were never made public. One of the investigating officers, in a private memo uncovered in 2004, wrote that the ledgers had included entries on people who hadn't reported thefts, perhaps didn't even realize they had been victims. Some entries were bizarrely abstract. CS took the pause between his lines. It was worth more than the verse. HL removed her bitterness. She'll notice eventually. A boy 9 no name gave me a secret, I kept it. Some scholars now believe Cedric was documenting emotional pickpocketing grief, insecurity, desire harvested through conversation and contact. But if true, this moves his crimes into murky philosophical territory. Was it theft, or was he documenting what people unintentionally surrendered? IV. Millicent reappears. In 1986, a rare books dealer in Edinburgh received a box of antique poetry chapbooks from an anonymous seller. Inside one of them, Stillness in Steam, by Millicent Hargrave, was a receipt for a rental cottage in West Wales dated 1972, signed simply, M.H. A local journalist followed the lead and traced the cottage. The landlady at the time remembered a quiet woman who spoke little, walked often, and mailed long letters but never got any. In the fireplace flue, she'd once found ash-coated scraps of torn paper, some bearing the name Cedric. Could Millicent have known about the ledger? Had she, somehow, discovered that Cedric had kept her words, her poem, her moment? The woman had stayed only one summer and then disappeared again. No body was ever found, no death certificate, nothing but a poem and the memory of a name. V. Cedric's final act. No one knows when Cedric Whitlow died, if he died at all. But in 1991, a man calling himself Charles Weatherby sent a donation of £10,000 to the British Library's Poetic Manuscript Division. Enclosed was a letter. Consider this the fee for listening without judgment. Let the archive grow. Let those whose words were stolen now find new readers. Some trims leave deeper cuts than razors ever could. The donation was accepted, though the sender was never verified. The envelope was postmarked from Dorset. VI, the Recovered Voices Project. Inspired by Cedric's ledgers, the Recovered Voices Project was launched in 2000 by a group of literary historians and archivists. Their goal? To track down the original writers or descendants of those whose words had been archived by Cedric. Some were located, many had passed, a few were shocked. One man, the son of poet Edgar Drenning, read his father's long-lost limericks aloud at a public reading for the first time in 60 years. I hated poetry growing up, he said, but this was like meeting my father again. Another contributor, Anna Rowe, discovered a draft love poem from her late mother tucked among the Whitlow fragments. She never gave it to my father. I wonder if it would have changed things. VII, lasting impact on investigative work. Though Whitlow's case may seem artistic in tone, it changed how certain crimes of intimacy are understood. Investigators began paying closer attention to motive profiles where theft wasn't for gain, but for meaning. This had implications in everything from corporate espionage to art heists. A niche term emerged in criminal psychology circles. Symbolic kleptomania, the compulsion to steal not for value, but for what an object represents. Cedric became a textbook case. His actions, though inarguably illegal, opened a door into how obsession, artistry, and human interaction can blend in unexpected ways. VII, a reflection in stillness. Perhaps the most disquieting aspect of Cedric's story isn't that he stole from poets, but that they kept coming back. Even after rumors began, few stopped visiting his chair. Was it his gentle demeanor? Was it the strange seduction of being seen so clearly? Or was it something darker, the unconscious knowledge that something would be taken and the quiet permission they gave? When asked in an interview why no one pressed harder for Whitlow to be punished beyond the short sentence, Detective Lillingworth replied, "Because everyone lost something with him, but they all got something back too, even if it was just silence." The last line. At the end of one of Cedric's hidden ledgers, there's an entry that doesn't fit the rest. It's scrawled at the bottom of the final page. Not labeled, not dated. Just a line. "I listened until they vanished, then I made them stay." Epilogue, you the listener. You've now heard the story of Cedric Whitlow, the barber who quoted Yeats while committing quiet crimes, who made himself invisible in a room designed for intimacy, who took what was never given out loud. He never brandished a weapon, never broke a window, never raised his voice. And yet, the echo of what he did lingers long after the hair has been swept away. So now ask yourself, if someone took your truest words before you said them, would you even notice they were gone? Detective Mail Story 2, The Cemetery Forgery Syndicate. Death is a quiet business until it's not. You've probably never thought about who handles the paperwork when someone dies. The death certificate, the burial authorization, the property transfers. It's an avalanche of quiet forms. But in the early 1990s, in a sun-bleached corner of southern Arizona, those forms became the foundation of a low-profile, high-profit criminal operation that stretched across state lines. It was run by a man named Harmon Ellis, former cemetery caretaker, amateur calligrapher, and the quiet center of a multi-million-dollar forgery ring. His operation went unnoticed for years, because no one suspects the dead. The town where it started. Bisbee, Arizona is a picturesque town, a kind of desert leftover from the Old West. It has clapboard houses, copper mine tour, and a population of fewer than 6,000. The cemetery sits on a hill just past the town limits, surrounded by dry brush and flinty rock. Harmon Ellis worked at the Evergreen Cemetery for 11 years. He was never late. He rarely spoke. He wore a pressed shirt even in 100-degree heat. Locals thought he was respectful of the dead, but in truth, Harmon just liked order. He kept meticulous notes about everything: who visited, who didn't, which flowers were replaced, and which headstones bore dates that didn't line up with the county records. That's where it began, with a few missing dates. Discrepancies in dust. In 1993, a clerk at the Cochise County Recorder's office noticed something odd. A property transfer for a ranch outside Bisbee listed the previous owner as deceased, but no death certificate had been filed. Further investigation revealed a headstone already erected in Evergreen Cemetery for this same individual, Marion Kingsley. The date of death was etched in marble, June 14, 1992. But there was no obituary, no funeral home records, no burial permit, no death certificate anywhere. What the clerk didn't know, and what Harmon Ellis did, was that Marion Kingsley had left the country quietly in 1989. She was not dead. She had simply walked away from a troubled family and into self-imposed exile in Chile. And Harmon had declared her dead anyway. Why? Because Marion Kingsley owned land, and that land could be transferred for a price. The Signature Factory. Detective Carla Pena was the one who started pulling at the threads. She had a background in document fraud and had seen her share of fake IDs and real estate cons. But the Kingsley case had an eerie quiet to it, no bluster, no obvious motive. She went to Evergreen Cemetery herself. There she found a row of 5 graves with fresh plaques, all dated within the same 18-month period, all with clean, sand-blasted lettering, all without corresponding records in the county files. One of them, Robert H. Tiller, had apparently died in 1991, but Tiller had voted in the 1992 presidential election in Oregon. Another, Lisa Breen, was supposedly interred on May 3, 1993, but she'd received a speeding ticket in Las Vegas 4 months later. The headstones were fake, but they were convincing. Forged in granite. Harmon's scheme was disturbingly simple. He started by identifying individuals who had fallen off the grid, missing persons, elderly drifters, or people who had left the country without clear records. Using public obituaries, church newsletters, and even gossip columns, he compiled a list of targets. Next, he created false death certificates quietly. His background in calligraphy made it easy to replicate the handwritten forms common at the time. He forged doctor signatures, mimicked county stamps, and even sourced expired carbon copy pads from local print shops. Then came the paperwork to transfer properties, cancel debts, or apply for benefits. And to make it all look legitimate, he purchased cheap granite markers from out-of-state stone cutters, etched them with fabricated dates, and installed them himself, usually in the dead of night. No ceremony, no body, just a marker in dry dirt and a paper trail buried behind it. The graveyard shift crew. Ellis didn't work alone. Over time, he built a quiet network of co-conspirators, mostly out-of-work groundskeepers and part-time funeral staff from neighboring counties. Some were in it for the money. Others didn't even realize they were helping commit crimes. One of them was a man named Virgil "Bud" Jensen, a former crematorium assistant who handled the dummy cremation records. Another was a notary named Gail Sommers, who, under the guise of helping the bereaved, would rubber-stamp documents without asking too many questions. And then there was the enigmatic Camille, never fully identified, who was believed to be the courier for Harmon's forged paperwork, traveling across Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas with a suitcase full of signatures and sorrow. Quiet wealth, no flash. Unlike most fraudsters, Harmon didn't flaunt his money. He lived in a modest adobe duplex. He drove a 12-year-old Buick. He wore the same desert-toned shirt to work every day. He claimed to have a brother in Tucson, though no such person ever surfaced. But he was moving money quietly. Through a trust fund registered to a now-deceased accountant, another of his fabricated deaths, Harmon filtered proceeds from fraudulent property sales into anonymous LLCs. Detective Pena discovered at least 17 fraudulent property transfers tied to these phantom deaths. Estimated total value, $3.2 million. But she couldn't yet prove it was Harmon. She needed more. She needed to catch him forging a ghost. The break came from a typo. The moment that cracked the case was small, barely noticeable. A forged death certificate for a woman named Linda Canfield listed her doctor as Dr. Thomas Rayleigh. But the actual doctor's name was Thomas Riley. No E. Detective Pena checked with Dr. Riley, who denied signing any such document. Handwriting analysis confirmed the signature was a forgery. Then came the coincidence that made her stomach twist. Linda Canfield was not just alive, she was visiting her sister in Sierra Vista, less than 40 miles from Bisbee. She'd been declared dead by someone in the same town. She was spending the weekend. It was too sloppy for Harmon's usual precision, which made Pena believe he was either getting reckless or someone else was mimicking his mimicry. The trap is set. Using Canfield's forged certificate as bait, Pena initiated a sting operation. She had the county issue a silent internal alert that the document was under investigation, but made no public noise about it. Then she waited. A week later, a request was submitted to transfer a parcel of Canfield's rural land to a new trust, Redstone Holdings, LLC. Redstone was already on Pena's radar from another suspicious transfer months prior. The signature on the transfer form, a perfect match for the one on Canfield's fake death certificate. Now they had him. An empty house and a full ledger. But when they arrived at Harmon Ellis's house with a warrant in hand, it was empty. Inside they found 2 typewriters, 7 counterfeit county seals, over 200 blank headstone templates, a list of 38 names labeled viable deceased, and most chilling of all, a leather-bound ledger titled Departures. Each page detailed a name, birth date, and false death date. Below it, Harmon had written a one-line obituary forged in tone, style, and sentimentality. One read, "She danced once on the mesa and never stopped moving." Another, "He forgave the land before he left it." The handwriting was elegant, controlled, poetic. Detective Pena stared at the ledger for hours. The last name in the book was blank. Underneath it said only, "Soon." Harmon's vanishing act. When authorities arrived at Harmon Ellis's modest adobe duplex, they expected resistance. They found silence. The front door was unlocked. There were no signs of forced entry or struggle. A pot of tea sat cooling on the stove, a slice of toast left untouched on a chipped plate. The bed was made, the floor swept. Harmon had vanished as cleanly as one of his ghosts. He left no goodbye, no forwarding address, and most curiously no trace on surveillance or transportation logs. He didn't fly. He didn't drive. He didn't rent a car or buy a bus ticket. But he did leave behind one final note. Folded neatly on the mantel above the fireplace, it read, "Not all disappearances are tragedies. Some are decisions." It was signed in his usual careful hand. Aye, echoes from the ledger. Detective Carla Pena spent days combing through Harmon's ledger, Departures. Each entry told a story fabricated, yes, but disturbingly elegant. She realized quickly that Harmon hadn't just forged death certificates. He'd forged lives. Some of the names listed were real people who had indeed vanished or left society behind. Others were partially fabricated, combinations of real birth records and imaginary fates. The emotional tone of each obituary revealed something unsettling. Harmon wasn't merely profiting from anonymity. He was writing endings for people who had none. Pena began to suspect something deeper, that Harmon wasn't driven by greed alone. He was driven by a pathological desire for closure. And the power to grant it. The clients of the dead. Who bought these properties? Where did the money go? The trail led to a handful of anonymous LLCs and shell buyers, mostly retirees, small developers, and in one case, a man who thought he'd gotten a great deal on a ghost town parcel outside Wilcox. None of the buyers knew the deeds were fraudulent. Most had used title companies that had been duped by Harmon's paperwork. But 2 names surfaced repeatedly. Dawes and Minter Legal Processing and Cambric Fiduciary Trust, both registered in Nevada, both established within months of each other, both using Harmon's known aliases on early registration forms. Dawes and Minter, it turned out, wasn't a law firm. It was a mailbox in Las Vegas. Cambric Fiduciary, an online form creation business that had never existed beyond a P.O. box and a disconnected phone line. Harmon had created not just people, but institutions' entire legal scaffolding made of vapor and signatures. IV, an accidental witness. The break came from an unlikely source, a cemetery volunteer named Annalee Bryant, age 67, who had helped maintain historical grave records at Evergreen Cemetery. Annalee had once worked side by side with Harmon on weekends, cataloging unmarked graves. She told Pena something peculiar. He had this habit when we passed a fresh grave. He'd stop and jot something in his notebook, not the name, mind you, but a feeling, a phrase, like he was collecting stories, not dates. One time she'd seen him copy the wrong name from a headstone. When she pointed it out, he smiled and said, The name isn't always the most important part. She hadn't thought much of it until the investigation began. Annalee, it turns out, had unwittingly helped Harmon log unused grave plots, ones where families had reserved a space but hadn't yet buried anyone. He would then assign those names to people who were alive but missing and fabricate a death around them. Camille comes into focus. The woman known only as Camille had always been a ghost in the file. But a break in a forgery case out of Santa Fe brought her name forward. Camille St. James, a former DMV clerk turned freelance document runner. She had disappeared from her job in 1995 after being accused of processing illegal title transfers. The charges were dropped due to lack of evidence. Camille had briefly lived in Bisbee under the name Ruth Hallow, where she rented a room above a hardware store. Around the same time, Harmon was ramping up his operations. Her signature appeared on 3 death certificate applications, now known to be forged. But like Harmon, she was never found. Some investigators believe the two fled together. Others think Harmon may have written her out, fabricating her disappearance just as he had so many others. The psychology of forging death. In interviews years later, Carla Pena described Harmon not as a con man, but as something stranger. He had a god complex, but a quiet one, not about power, about endings. I think he believed people needed to be concluded. That disappearing was worse than dying without a name, so he gave them one. That's what made the scheme so difficult to detect. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't greedy in the traditional sense. It was ritualistic. Each forged death had a strange narrative logic to it, a life resolved, a document printed, a stone set. And then he'd move on. The Red Ledger. Among the final documents found in Harmon's storage unit, discovered a year after his disappearance, was a red leather-bound journal labeled Resolutions. It was different from departures. It listed people Harmon had refused to forge. Why? The notes beside their names were haunting. Too many still looking for her. Grief will notice. His son visits weekly, can't interfere. She still writes letters, not mine to close. The entries suggested something chilling. Harmon had developed a moral framework around his crimes. He wouldn't forge someone's death unless he believed no one else needed them to live. The body in Yuma. In 2004, a decomposed body was found in an abandoned rail car near Yuma, Arizona. Male, late 60s to early 70s. No ID, no obvious signs of trauma, but a matchbook in his coat pocket bore the inscription, "Not all disappearances are tragedies." Detective Pena, long retired but still consulted occasionally, was brought in to review the case. Dental records were inconclusive, but the handwriting on the matchbook matched Harmon's. Inside the man's jacket was a single folded note. "I leave no inheritance, only empty spaces." Age. The body was never positively identified, but it was buried in a municipal plot under the name John H. Ellis. Plot number 117C. Stone paid for in cash by an anonymous donor. What remains of the syndicate? Today, the case of the cemetery forgery syndicate is studied in criminal justice courses and document fraud seminars. It remains one of the most successful long-term forgery rings in U.S. history. More than 41 fabricated deaths were confirmed. Estimated value of stolen assets, $6.1 million. The true total may be higher. Of the co-conspirators, Virgil Bud Jensen was found dead of natural causes in 2001. Gail Sommers served a 6-month sentence and now works at a hospice center in Tucson. Camille St. James remains at large. Harmon Ellis, if he died at all, left no fingerprints behind. An open plot. And so we return to the cemetery. To Evergreen. Plot 90, 7A still sits empty, a bare patch of dust in the corner near the old mesquite tree. It was one of the original fake graves Harmon forged, but no one has ever claimed it. Some visitors say it feels colder than the others. Some say it's reserved for Harmon himself. But others, like Pena, believe Harmon is still out there living under a different name, a new identity forged with the same quiet care he gave to the dead. Because death was never his endgame. Only erasure was. I, the living ghost. By the late 2000s, nearly every trace of Harmon Ellis had been absorbed into folklore. In Bisbee, he became something of a myth, a ghost of the living, whispered about in quiet tones at bars and antique shops. The caretaker who made his own dead, locals would say. The man who made the missing disappear. But what made Harmon truly haunting wasn't just what he did. It was how thoroughly he made himself vanish. Even the people closest to him, if you could say, he had anyone struggled to describe him. He was like a wind between gravestones, said one former groundskeeper. You'd know he'd been there only after something had changed. And yet, even winds leave traces. The interview that shouldn't exist. In 2011, a retired journalist named Evan Darby published a self-published ebook titled The Forger in the Grass. It went largely unnoticed, only a few dozen digital sales. In the book, Darby claimed to have interviewed a man in 2003 in a desert roadside diner outside Sierra Blanca, Texas. The man introduced himself as Miles Hensley. But Darby, who had once covered the Harmon Ellis case in the 90s, became convinced this man was Harmon. He described a gaunt, soft-spoken man with weathered hands, perfectly clean fingernails, and a peculiar way of observing everyone around him before speaking. The man said he had once worked in cemetery logistics. When asked what that meant, he replied, "I helped people say goodbye to people who were already gone." Darby pressed. The man gave no direct answers but eventually offered a story about how sometimes letting someone be believed dead was a greater kindness than letting them keep fatting while alive. He said, "Some people just need a death to be free. I offered them one clean, quiet, and paper-thin." The man paid for his coffee in exact change. He left no tip, but scrawled into the corner of the napkin was a familiar phrase. Not all disappearances are tragedies. Darby later matched the handwriting to Harmon's court documents. A theory emerges. Criminologists began to shift their perspective on Harmon Ellis in the years after his disappearance. Instead of a traditional forger or fraudster, he was re-evaluated as a death certificate artist, someone who didn't just forge documents, but crafted conclusions. Professor Lyle Treming, a sociologist from the University of New Mexico, published a paper in Criminal Deviance Quarterly titled, "The Compassionate Forger, Harmon Ellis and the Ethics of Erasure." In it, he argued, Ellis didn't forge death. He created narrative silence. He filled the cultural need for finality. In a society allergic to ambiguity, he offered punctuation where only ellipses had been. It was a controversial stance, but it resonated with some of the families involved, especially those who had, unknowingly, lost someone to Ellis's pen. The Forged Widow. One such family was the Rodricks of Tombstone, Arizona. In 1995, they received notice that their estranged uncle Gideon Roderick had passed and that his rural land would be transferring to a holding company for auction. They were shocked. Gideon had disappeared in 1987 after a bitter legal battle over family land. There had been no contact since. But they accepted the news, they grieved, they sold the land. Only later, after the Ellis investigation came to light, did they learn that Gideon hadn't died. He had been forged. His forged obituary, crafted by Harmon, read, "Left in peace, in the place he always loved beneath the cottonwood shade. Years later, one of the nieces, Clara Roderick, would say, "In a weird way, it helped. We stopped being angry. We mourned him. I think he needed someone to do that, even if it was by deception." The numbers that don't add up. While authorities confirmed at least 41 fraudulent death records, the ledgers hinted at a far larger count. The departures journal had 98 entries. The resolutions ledger had 57. That's a total of 155 individuals either forged or considered for forgery. But there's more. In 2017, the Arizona Historical Records Center declassified a cache of handwritten correspondence between Harmon and an unknown contact believed to be Camille. One letter, unsigned but clearly in Harmon's script, read, "Of the 213 I've tracked, only 47 seemed truly forgotten. The others still had echoes. I can't steal echoes." That line sent chills through the investigators. Was Harmon selecting his victims not based on opportunity, but on emotional disconnection? If so, then the cemetery forgery syndicate was not just a crime ring. It was a moral system built around disappearances that no one grieved. A message in marble. In 2019, a retired gravedigger named Robert Bell was restoring old headstones at Evergreen Cemetery when he came across one that had weathered differently than others. He chipped away at the moss-covered surface, revealing an engraving that had been intentionally faint. "Here rests what you forgot." No name, no dates. Nothing else. Pena, who was still occasionally consulted by forensic historians, confirmed that the stone's dimensions matched the cheap templates Harmon had used. But the grave beneath it was empty. A planted symbol. Or a confession. What the deaths meant. If Harmon truly saw himself as a craftsman of conclusions, then each forged death wasn't an erasure, but an attempt at emotional surgery. Cutting out lingering ambiguity. Offering in his own warped way peace. But peace by deception is still deceit. He gave some people closure. He gave others financial ruin. And he gave the criminal justice world one of its most difficult philosophical questions. Can the act of forging a death ever be merciful? The remaining envelopes. To this day, several of Harmon's forged identities remain unresolved. Authorities continue to search for the real Camille St. James, the origin of Redstone Holdings LLC bank accounts, the total number of individuals falsely declared dead, whether any of Harmon's forged deaths were murders covered up under false records. No evidence of violence has ever surfaced. But then again, Harmon was a man who never needed to lift a hand. His weapon was paperwork. His silence lethal. A whispered legacy. Harmon Ellis's impact lives on not only in case files and forensic textbooks, but in cultural memory. There are documentaries, short films, even a limited series in production titled Signature, but none have captured the full disquiet of the real events. Because how do you dramatize absence? How do you build suspense around someone who was only ever seen through paper, stone, and echoes? The final death. The last entry in departures was, as noted before, blank. Just one word at the bottom. Soon. Some think it was a plan to fake his own death. Others think it was a warning that he was watching someone else vanish. But there's a third theory. That soon wasn't about death at all. It was about you, the reader, the investigator, the listener. The person who would eventually stumble upon his story, haunted by his careful crimes, unsure whether to fear him or understand him. Because in the end, Harmon Ellis may have gotten what he wanted most: to be remembered as the man who let people forget. Detective Mail Story 3, The Choir Girl Poisonings. A town that sang before it knew silence. The town of Hale's Edge, nestled in a green dip between two low ridges in Vermont, is the kind of place that still prints its church bulletins by hand. It had one diner, one florist, and one remarkable choir. Every Sunday morning, the sound of angelic harmony drifted through the steepled windows of First Grace Presbyterian. The voices were clear, disciplined, and young. The church's children's choir, the Morning Petals, had been the pride of Hale's Edge for nearly 2 decades. And in the winter of 1998, they began to die. Aye, aye, the first voice silenced. On December 13, 1998, 11-year-old Clara Lorne collapsed during a rehearsal, moments after completing a solo run of In the Bleak Midwinter. She fell sideways off the risers, convulsed for 20 seconds, and lost consciousness. She was pronounced dead at Hale County Memorial Hospital less than an hour later. The initial cause, cardiac arrhythmia. It was tragic but not suspicious. Clara had no known heart condition, but sudden deaths among children, while rare, are not unheard of. The town mourned. Her choir robe hung at the front of the church for the remainder of the season. But 3 weeks later, another girl fell ill. And then a third. Aye, 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 an invisible pattern emerges. By the end of February 1999, 4 children from the Morning Petals had been hospitalized. 2 had died. All 4 had shown similar symptoms: tremors, visual distortions, muscle weakness, and eventually respiratory collapse. The 3rd and 4th survived, but only after weeks of intensive care. Dr. Marla Zheng, a pediatric neurologist from Montpelier who was consulted by Hale County, immediately flagged the cases as neurological, not cardiac. She ordered a panel of toxicology screenings. The results showed something horrifying. Each child had elevated mercury levels far beyond acceptable limits. One case was over 10 times the toxic threshold. These children had been poisoned. IV, the choir director. The focus immediately turned to the one adult who had consistent, unsupervised access to all the victims. Mrs. Lorraine Bell, choir director for First Grace Presbyterian since 1983. Lorraine was 62, a widow, and described as stern but loving. She held a degree in music education and had taught in local public schools for nearly 2 decades before retiring to focus on church work. No complaints had ever been filed against her. She was beloved by parents, respected by peers. But when interviewed by local police, she said something that unnerved them. "Some voices are just too fragile for the work, I could always tell." When asked what the work meant, she declined to clarify. She denied having contact with anything toxic. She denied seeing symptoms in the children, and she denied any involvement. But her desk told a different story. The open drawer. In Lorraine Bell's office, among the sheet music and metronomes, officers found a small wooden drawer tucked into the underside of her desk. Inside were 3 unmarked vials, all with a cloudy metallic residue. A vintage mercury thermometer, cracked. Several pages of handwritten notes in musical notation, interspersed with cryptic phrases like "clearer tone through tension," "vibrato possible only through soft muscle struggle," "fleeting purity must be caught before it vanishes." The vials tested positive for mercury, Roman 2 chloride, a highly toxic compound. Lorraine claimed she had no knowledge of the drawer. She said it had likely belonged to the previous director, who died in 1982. But her fingerprints were found on one of the vial stoppers, and on a sheet of music smudged with mercury. The survivors speak. Of the 2 children who survived the illness, only one, Naomi Ellis, remembered anything significant. In an interview with child psychologists, Naomi said, "I remember her hands. They were always cold. She said if we felt dizzy during practice, it meant we were doing it right. that the song was starting to live in us. She also recalled Lorraine giving her and the others special tea before performances, always in white mugs with little gold angels. The remaining mug in Lorraine's office tested positive for trace amounts of mercury. Authorities now believe the poison had been ingested, likely through hot drinks prepared before practice. When asked about the tea, Lorraine simply said, "I would never hurt a child, but they must understand that beauty costs." VII, trial by community. Lorraine Bell was arrested in March 1999 and charged with 2 counts of second-degree murder and 2 counts of attempted murder. Her trial became national news. The media dubbed it the choir girl poisonings. Court testimony revealed that Lorraine had once pursued a doctorate in music physiology, but had dropped out in the 1970s after a paper she wrote was rejected by the academic board. The paper reportedly explored the relationship between neurological tension and purity of vocal tone. She had never published it, but in court, a copy was recovered from her attic. In it, she theorized, slight physical duress heightens emotional vocal range. Innocence under strain can create a sound of transcendent pain. She had applied this theory to children. VII, the church's response. First Grace Presbyterian issued an immediate statement distancing themselves from Lorraine Bell. The pastor resigned quietly 2 weeks into the trial. The choir was disbanded. Members of the church removed all photographs of the children from the bulletin boards. Some community members claimed the church had known something was off. For years, unexplained fevers, fatigue among choir members, whispers of excessive discipline, but no one had spoken out. One deacon said, "She always said they were delicate. We thought she meant spiritually." But others stood by Lorraine, insisting she would never intentionally poison a child. They claimed the mercury was a coincidence, an environmental accident, or sabotage. Still, the evidence was mounting. And the most chilling moment of the trial came when a handwriting expert confirmed that Lorraine herself had written. The voice is at its peak just before the body declines. The verdict. On July 2, 1999, after 8 weeks of testimony, Lorraine Bell was found guilty on all counts. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She showed no emotion at the reading of the verdict. When asked if she had anything to say, she looked at the parents of the victims and said, "They sang beautifully, don't you remember?" That sentence is now engraved on a memorial stone in Hales Edge Cemetery, placed there by grieving parents as a bitter reminder of what was taken. The memorial reads, "They sang beautifully, and they should have lived." The town after the music stopped. In the years since the trial, Hales Edge has never re-established its children's choir. The church attendance dropped by nearly half. A new pastor was brought in, but the space still carries a shadow. The choir room is locked. No one uses the old rehearsal risers. Of the surviving families, some moved away. Others remain quiet, cautious, waiting for time to heal something that refuses to scar over. But the memory lingers. A melody that hangs in the air, even after the final note has long since faded. An echo in the hospital halls. Children's hospitals are meant to be places of hope. Pastel-painted walls, cheerful murals, animal-shaped pillows on the beds. But in the spring of 1999, the pediatric wing of Hale County Memorial bore the strange weight of a crime too complex for most to understand. 2 choir girls, Naomi Ellis, age 10, and Fiona Brooks, age 12, were still in recovery, their bodies slowly processing and expelling the mercury they'd unknowingly ingested. Both experienced periods of aphasia, trembling, and recurring dreams of singing in a room that grew colder with every note. One nurse described it as caring for children who had songs trapped in their throats. The Mystery of the Choir Book. 2 weeks into Lorraine Bell's trial, detectives uncovered a key piece of evidence that had initially been dismissed as irrelevant. An old spiral-bound music book found buried beneath boxes in the church's rehearsal closet. The book contained handwritten annotations not in Bell's usual precise handwriting, but in a messy, cursive scrawl believed to date back to her early teaching years. Some of the notes were benign, breathe between measures, softened tone here, but others raised alarms. Exertion increases resonance. Weak lungs equals angelic release. Capture before collapse. It was theorized that this book reflected Bell's early experimentation with the boundaries of vocal performance under strain, a cruel blend of pedagogy and pathology. On the last page, scribbled hastily, "It's not pain, it's clarity. A forgotten incident revisited." As investigators reviewed Bell's decades-long career, they stumbled upon a buried personnel file from 1986. It detailed a parent complaint made while Bell was teaching music at a middle school in Montpelier. The complaint, filed by the mother of a student named Daisy Tuck, alleged that Bell had pressured her daughter into long solo rehearsals despite recurring nosebleeds and fainting episodes. No formal action had been taken. Daisy later moved away and died in 1991, after what was officially ruled as complications from an autoimmune disorder. But the symptoms, tremors, coordination issues, and speech slurring, eerily mirrored those seen in the poisoned choir girls. Daisy's death was never investigated as a poisoning. Until now. A pattern in the past. Retired Detective Edgar Mullen, who had worked in the Montpelier area during the 80s, came forward during the reopened inquiry. He recalled another case involving a private children's recital where 2 boys collapsed during a performance. Both recovered, but no cause was identified at the time. And who was the guest vocal coach at that recital? Lorraine Bell. Mullen had dismissed it then, just stage nerves, he'd written in the report. But in hindsight, it appeared to be the first known instance of Bell experimenting with her theories on resonant fragility, using the stresses of poison to push children's voices into ethereal, tremulous ranges. He described the discovery with one word: chilling. Naomi's journey. While Naomi Ellis was undergoing speech therapy, her mother discovered a half-filled diary in her backpack, dating back to the weeks before her collapse. In it, Naomi wrote things that now read like warnings. Ms. Bell said the tea was to calm the butterflies in my throat. I'm not supposed to tell Mom about the solo sessions. When I get dizzy, that means I'm singing properly. She touches the back of my neck and says, "That's where your soul sings from." These entries became part of the case archive and were presented during the second phase of the trial, where prosecutors pushed for additional charges tied to psychological abuse and medical neglect. Fiona's recovery and revelation. Fiona Brooks, older and more articulate, was interviewed by forensic psychologists in July of 1999. She was still weak, her speech slow and halting, but what she remembered sent a ripple through the courtroom when the testimony was read aloud. She told me that God only took the voices he loved the most, that if it hurt to sing, that meant he was listening. When asked if she believed Bell had meant to harm her, Fiona paused, then said, "I don't think she saw it as harm. She wanted our voices to break something open. She called it the clean fracture." Fiona also recalled being asked to drink tea from a chipped mug, with a line etched into the bottom: "Your pain will make them weep." That mug was later recovered and tested positive for mercury residue. The psychology of control. Criminal profiler Dr. Peter Haverson was brought in by prosecutors to help the jury understand Lorraine Bell's likely motives. He described her not as sadistic, but as doctrinal. Bell had constructed a theological and musical belief system around the idea that suffering amplifies truth, that the purity of children's voices was not inherent but had to be refined like metal through pressure and heat. Only her pressure was toxic, literally. Haverson labeled her a harmonic mystic, someone who fused spiritual idealism, musical obsession, and a clinical detachment from physical consequence. She was not performing ritual for power. She was performing ritual for sound. And the children were her instruments. The choir files. A search of Lorraine Bell's home revealed a locked cabinet filled with VHS tapes. Each was labeled only with the name of a choir member and a date. There were 142 tapes in total, dating back nearly 20 years. Some featured full rehearsals. Others appeared to be solo coaching sessions, one-on-one footage showing Lorraine instructing the children with an unnerving level of intensity. She rarely raised her voice, but her corrections were sharp. In one tape, she stops a child mid-song and says, "You're protecting yourself. Let the line crack, yes crack, that's where the sorrow lives." Some tapes were handed over to the children's families. Others were deemed too disturbing and sealed under court order. Letters from prison. After her conviction, Lorraine Bell began writing to several families of her former choir members. Some refused to open them, but a few did, and what they found was not apology, but justification. One letter read, "They were transcendent. You don't understand what I heard. What they became, just before the end, it was beyond mortal." Another, "You heard screaming. I heard divinity." She signed every letter the same way. "In the service of sacred resonance. LB." These letters solidified the public view of her as both dangerous and delusional. A church without choirs. First Grace Presbyterian remains open, but only just. The choir room is now a storage space. The risers were dismantled and sold for scrap. A small plaque near the entrance reads, "For Clara, Jonah, Naomi, and Fiona, may your voices rise without pain." The town of Hales Edge no longer hosts youth recitals. Some parents still tell their children, "Don't sing after dark," a superstition that grew after the trial and stuck. And while the toxic exposure of Bell's crimes was confined to a small group, the emotional fallout spread far wider. It changed how small towns across the country looked at children's programs, adult supervision, and blind trust in tradition. The echo of those fragile voices can still be heard in memories, in old cassette recordings, in unanswered questions that follow even the most devout among the town's congregation. After the verdict, the silence. Lorraine Bell's sentencing in the summer of 1999 marked the end of one of Vermont's most disturbing criminal trials, but for many in Hales Edge, the real silence began after the gavel fell. The trial hadn't just convicted a woman. It had convicted a culture of trust without oversight, of sacred spaces with no checks, of towns that never asked the questions they should have. The pews of First Grace Presbyterian were no longer full, some congregants left in shame, others in grief. The stained glass window that once bore the image of a singing angel was replaced with plain frosted glass. The town never again held another children's choir. Fiona's farewell song. In 2001, Fiona Brooks, one of the two surviving girls, performed a solo rendition of "Let All Mortal Flesh Keep Silence" at a memorial concert in Montpelier. It was her first and only public performance since the poisoning. She recovered physically mostly, but her voice had changed thinner, softer, haunted by a slight tremble that hadn't been there before. Some called it beautiful. Others called it broken. In a short interview afterward, Fiona said, "I wanted to sing just once more on my terms. No tea, no pressure, just me. If it shakes, it shakes." She never sang publicly again. Naomi's life in stillness. Naomi Ellis, the youngest survivor, developed a rare auditory processing disorder in the years following her recovery. She would later describe her experience as hearing the world through water. She began painting instead of singing, often creating swirling, abstract portraits she claimed were the way music feels when it hurts. Her artwork was featured in a regional gallery under the collection title, Notes I Never Sang. In a rare 2010 interview, she was asked if she ever forgave Lorraine Bell. Her reply was simple. No, but I think she believed in what she was doing. That's what makes it worse. The missing tape. In 2005, during a recataloguing of court evidence for digital preservation, authorities discovered that one of the VHS tapes from Bell's home was missing. Tape 39. The label on the case still present in the box read only CL/solo final. CL likely referred to Clara Lorne, the first victim. The tape was believed to be the recording of her last solo session, perhaps only days before her sudden collapse in rehearsal. An internal inquiry was launched, but no one could determine whether the tape was misplaced, destroyed, or taken. To this day, its contents remain unknown. A chilling theory lingers among investigators that Bell may have removed it herself before her arrest, because it captured something even she couldn't justify. The new church leader's confession. In 2008, First Grace Presbyterian's newly appointed pastor, Reverend Mark Shields, made a public confession from the pulpit. He admitted that in 1997, just a year before Clara's death, he had received an anonymous note slipped under his office door. It read, "They sound like angels, but something is wrong. She's giving them something. Ask the kids, ask the tea." He dismissed it. He claimed it seemed too vague, possibly a prank or the paranoia of an anxious parent. He never confronted Bell, never contacted authorities. His voice trembled as he recounted it. "I chose not to know, and children paid for my silence." He resigned that same week. The choir files go public. In 2015, after pressure from victims' families and investigative journalists, the state unsealed 30 of the 142 tapes found in Bell's collection. The rest remained sealed due to privacy concerns and the wishes of families. The released tapes were archived by the University of Vermont as part of a research project titled Sacred Harm: Documentation of Spiritualized Abuse in American Institutions. Researchers studying the footage reported a chilling pattern. Bell routinely emphasized vocal purity through physical fragility. She told children to sing like you're too tired to speak and let the ache into your throat. A senior archivist, after reviewing several hours of footage, commented, "You can hear the harm, you don't even need to see it. It's in the breathing, in the pauses between notes." A community left with questions. Despite years of investigation and analysis, many in Hale's Edge still wonder how this could happen and why no one spoke sooner. Some blame the closed nature of small-town culture. Some say it was the blind reverence for tradition, for the aesthetics of worship, for the beauty of innocent voices rising up like incense. Others believe the town was entranced not by Bell's charisma, but by what she offered. The illusion that purity could be produced, rehearsed, and performed on command. But there's a darker truth at play, one that lingers like poison. Because what Lorraine Bell really sold was the idea that beauty was worth any cost. Even the cost of a child's life. Lorraine's final years. Lorraine Bell died in prison in 2018 at the age of 81. Official cause: respiratory failure following complications from pneumonia. She had served 19 years of a life sentence, no visitors, no appeals. In her final year, she wrote a 47-page manifesto titled The Harmonic Principle of Suffering. It was never published. It was reportedly filled with musical diagrams, theology-laced arguments, and philosophical claims that only the breaking of form reveals divine resonance. The manuscript was impounded by the state. Its final sentence: if they sang in pain, it's because they were chosen. IX, the Soundless Memorial. In 2020, the town of Hales Edge erected a soundless memorial on the old choir riser foundation behind the church. It's a circle of white stones, each engraved with the name of one of the children who suffered: Clara, Jonah, Naomi, Fiona, and a simple line from Psalm 137. How shall we sing the Lord's song in a strange land? No music is played at the memorial. It's designed to be silent. Visitors are encouraged to sit in the circle, to listen to memory, to whine, to guilt. Because for a town that prized its music above all, silence became the only thing left to offer. Epilogue, the song you'll never hear. Some say that music heals. Others say it haunts. But what happened in Hales Edge forces us to ask a question more unsettling. What happens when music becomes the mask for harm? Lorraine Bell didn't wield a weapon. She wielded a choir, a sacred art turned inward until it cut. And long after the robes were packed away and the hymns retired, her legacy continues to echo. Not in song, but in the ache of every parent who wonders whether they were too trusting. And in the voice of every child who was told their pain made them beautiful. Detective Mail Story 4, Midnight Ledger, the embezzler who played jazz. The man in the fedora. In the smoky back rooms of Kansas City's dwindling jazz clubs, they called him Ledger. He was always their fifth stool from the end, bourbon in one hand, battered saxophone case at his feet. He didn't play often anymore, but when he did, every head turned. He played like someone confessing. What no one realized at the time was that he was confessing. His name was Norman Royce, and while he was known in the city as a half-retired jazz musician, his real job was far quieter and far more dangerous. By day, he worked as the chief accountant for a small but influential trust company. And for 15 years, Norman Royce had embezzled over $4.7 million, siphoning cash from dormant accounts, forged sign-offs, and silent estates. He played jazz at night to stay calm. He cooked the books during the day to stay rich. The bank with a past. The Midwest Consolidated Trust and Surety had been around since 1934, a Depression-era relic with a marble lobby and a reputation for discretion. The kind of place where old money put its secrets and often forgot them. Norman had joined the firm in 1981 after serving in the Army as a finance officer. Clean record, quiet demeanor, fastidious handwriting. He wore cufflinks even in the heat. He never married, rented the same one-bedroom apartment for over 20 years. On paper, Norman Royce was invisible. And that's exactly how he liked it. The first missing dollar. In 1993, a compliance audit flagged a minor discrepancy: $8,000 missing from a dormant client account. The client had died in 1972. The estate had been closed. The funds were held in a no-interest escrow, technically untouched for decades. No heirs had come forward. The file was labeled Legacy Hold, Do Not Transfer. And yet the funds were gone. At the time, it was chalked up to a clerical error, a lost paper trail from the pre-digital days. No one suspected Norman, because Norman had flagged the discrepancy himself and recommended no further action. How to steal quietly. Norman's method was meticulous. He didn't steal from active accounts. He targeted legacy holdings trusts, forgotten deposits, accounts under litigation, or those tied up in generational transfers. If a client hadn't accessed an account in more than 10 years, Norman would mark it for manual review, citing digitization needs. Then he'd move a small sum, never more than 2% of the total, into a shell holding labeled ZTRLIAB, pending adjudication. That account had one signatory, himself. From there, the money would disappear in slow drips laundered through real estate holding groups, jazz club investments, and a phantom LLC named Midnight Ledger Holdings. He never bought a mansion. He never took vacations. He just played saxophone and embezzled like a poet. The jazz club connection. Norman's true weakness wasn't money. It was jazz. He'd studied at Juilliard briefly in the late 60s before being drafted. Music was his obsession, and Kansas City, still clinging to the ghost of Charlie Parker, was his sanctuary. Over the years, Norman quietly invested in 6 clubs across Missouri and Illinois, not to run them, but to keep them alive. He believed in the scene. He paid to fix plumbing, replace stolen amps, buy chairs no one would break. Club owners knew him only as Ledger, a rich, eccentric old-timer who handed out silent loans and expected nothing in return, except the occasional open mic. Only one person suspected there was more to him. Her name was Jessa Lane. The intern who listened. Jessa Lane was 26, a part-time bookkeeper and trumpet player who had taken a seasonal internship at Midwest Consolidated in 2002. She was sharp, restless, and instantly irritated by how the firm ran on paper logs and whispered protocols. She started to notice things. Account numbers with handwritten corrections. Transfer memos with Norman's initials, but no digital signature. Holding entries that went nowhere. One file caught her eye: the Greenbrier Family Trust, listed as inactive since 1985. The trust held $1.2 million. The last activity showed a withdrawal of $17,500 just 6 months prior. But the account was marked frozen, no disbursements. When she asked her supervisor about it, she was told, "That's one of Norman. He knows the old stuff. Don't touch it." So Jessa didn't touch it. She copied it. The tune he couldn't stop playing. Jessa started visiting the Ember Lounge, a jazz bar Norman frequented, to observe him. She watched how everyone greeted him with quiet respect. How the bartender set down his drink before he ordered. How once every few nights, he'd pull out that beat-up sax case and take the stage. He always played the same song first, Lush Life by Billy Strayhorn. A song about regret, lost glamour, and slow unraveling. She listened, she watched. She knew. This man had something to confess. The anonymous tip. Jessa contacted the office of the Comptroller of the Currency in June 2003, using an encrypted email alias. She sent them 4 account records, 3 questionable memos, and a list of transactions filtered through the so-called ZTR accounts. She titled the email, "Ledger Isn't Just Jazz." No response. For weeks, nothing happened. Then the banks were audited. And Norman noticed. A man slipping time. By fall of 2003, Norman had started making mistakes. His careful ledger entries became sloppy. His notes showed anxiety. He requested to be moved from digital systems back to full manual citing, strain. But internally, he was moving funds faster. Jessa, who had left the internship but still tracked the ZTR numbers from outside, saw the pattern. Norman was draining the accounts. Not just skimming. He was pulling out the entire legacy funds. In 1 week, he transferred $98,000 to a shell investment firm in Kansas, registered to a deceased jazz musician. It was the final move before flight. The solo that never ended. On October 19, 2003, Norman Royce walked into the Ember Lounge carrying his saxophone. He played for over an hour long, winding solos, no breaks, no announcements. The crowd grew quiet. Bartenders stopped serving. One club owner said it was like watching someone right there will through a melody. Then Norman left the stage, tipped the pianist, and walked out into the Kansas City night. He was never seen again. A manhunt with no face. When Norman Royce disappeared, there were no sirens, no warrants, not yet. He hadn't been officially accused of anything. There were no security videos of him fleeing, no clear paper trail of airline tickets, train rides, or border crossings. What investigators did have was a quiet tip from the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, OCC, to the Kansas City field office of the FBI. They had received an anonymous file months prior, a breadcrumb trail of financial irregularities at Midwest Consolidated Trust and Surety. All signs pointed to one man, the meticulous accountant with a saxophone and a ghost-like footprint. Jessa Lane gets a knock. Jessa Lane had moved on. She was working part-time at a music school and freelancing as a small business accountant when two agents showed up at her door. They wanted to know more about the tip. She didn't deny it. What she did deny, however, was that she'd understood the scale of what Norman had done. The files she shared suggested thefts in the range of $5,100K. In reality, it was far more. One agent showed her the number written in red ink across the top of the investigation folder. $4,768,400.37. Jessa felt sick. I thought he was just slipping some things, covering old debts, not bleeding the place dry. The hidden orchestra. The deeper the forensic audit team went, the more elegant the fraud became. Norman hadn't stolen randomly. He'd selected accounts like a conductor picking instruments spaced apart, never too loud at once. He'd created over 17 holding accounts, each named with bland legal phrases. Deferred asset pool, prelim litigation float, ZTRLAB. No two accounts were linked in the digital system. Some weren't even known to the current staff. They predated most employees. Even more baffling, Norman used no personal accounts to receive the funds. Instead, the money traveled through a rotating carousel of jazz clubs, estate cleanup contractors, private music tuition companies, nonprofits with inactive charters. Each shell entity was linked through a maze of paper to a single PO box under the name Ledger M. Royce. He had literally built an alias identity around his jazz nickname. The apartment and the absence. When authorities finally entered Norman's apartment, they found a single bed, 4 tailored suits, 2 saxophone neck straps, a wall of jazz vinyl's mini first pressings, and a locked file cabinet. Inside the cabinet were 6 notebooks, each one labeled with a single letter, a F. They weren't ledgers. They were personal compositions, jazz solos scribbled in dense notation. But instead of tempo markings and bar lines, the margins contained numbers. Investigators realized each musical piece mirrored a financial theft down to the amount stolen and the source account ID. In one solo titled Minor Ninth in Blue, the notations read, $22,400 GRNBRR Legacy, 1997, right arrow 2001. Right arrow ZTR float right arrow MLH. It was a cipher. He had composed music that told the story of his crimes. The music he left behind. Authorities brought in musicologists to study the compositions. What they found was extraordinary and disturbing. Each piece wasn't just a musical translation of a financial theft. It was an emotional rendering of it. Pieces tied to older estates had slower tempos, melancholy phrasing. The ones tied to large cash movements had sharp dissonance, urgency. One piece labeled simply Daisy had no notes, only rests. A full page of silence. A financial transfer with no corresponding theft, leading investigators to believe that Norman, at least once, intended to steal and changed his mind. Why? No one knows. VI, the Jazz Club confession. At the Ember Lounge, the bartender remembered something odd about Norman's final visit. He had paid for his drink not in cash, but with a cassette tape. He handed it over, said, "For the archive," and walked on stage. The bartender never played it. He gave it to the club's owner, who stashed it in a drawer for years. When investigators discovered this, they seized the tape and had it digitized. The audio was poor quality, but Norman's voice was unmistakable. This is for anyone who ever thought the numbers sang. You were right. They do. And sometimes they lie in key. What followed was 46 minutes of Norman playing saxophone unaccompanied. The final 60 seconds were silent. Then, the sound of him closing the saxophone case. VII, the International Theory. In 2005, a man fitting Norman's description was spotted in Lisbon, Portugal by an American jazz historian attending a street festival. The man played tenor saxophone, wore a fedora, and introduced himself only as Mr. Ledger. By the time officials were contacted, he was gone. Later that year, a Portuguese jazz club received an anonymous envelope containing $1,000, sheet music, and a note. For new reads and new lives. Interpol was notified, but the trail ended there. The man left no fingerprints. The sheet music had no matching registration anywhere in the world. VII, the fate of the money. Of the $4.7 million Norman Royce embezzled, less than $900,000 was ever recovered. Some jazz clubs reported spontaneous investments during the 1990s with no documentation. A few nonprofit grants turned out to be from non-existent foundations. One club in St. Louis had their mortgage paid off in full by a donation they believed came from a legacy patron. They kept playing jazz for another decade because of it. To this day, some clubs on the edge of survival whisper about the Ledger Fund, an urban legend about a missing embezzler who quietly finances the places he once loved. A legacy without closure. The FBI officially closed the case in 2014, citing insufficient evidence to prosecute or locate subject. But in the Kansas City jazz scene, Norman Royce is very much alive. At least once a year, a saxophone case is anonymously left at the Ember Lounge. Inside, reeds, handwritten solos, and a crisp $100 bill. The staff knows not to ask questions. They just add the solos to the wall, under a faded plaque that reads, "He cooked the books and stirred the soul. The sound that stole." Norman Royce didn't want riches. He wanted control. Over money, over melody, over myth. He used jazz not to cover his crimes, but to frame them, like an ornate border around an empty ledger. In the end, no one knows exactly how many accounts he touched. But they do know how he made them feel. Like something was being said between the notes. A man disappears, but the money still moves. After Norman Royce walked off stage that October night in 2003, the world forgot him, but the money didn't. The Midnight Ledger Holdings account stayed active for 6 more months, quietly issuing small disbursements to clubs, charities, and aging musicians across the American Midwest. The pattern was consistent. No one ever received more than $5,000, and all the checks were accompanied by sheet music or a handwritten note. One such note read, "You gave the city its echo, this is just the reverb. Another, "This solo's on me, but don't waste the silence between measures." Investigators eventually shut down the accounts, but not before over $130,000 was quietly distributed. It was the final phase of Norman's embezzlement. Not a getaway, a farewell tour. The accountant's manifesto. In 2008, a manuscript was discovered in a safe deposit box registered under Royce M. Ledge in Chicago. Inside was a typed document titled, "The Ethics of Quiet Theft, a Personal Ledger." It was never published. The FBI filed it as evidence, though no formal charges were ever brought posthumously. The manuscript opened with a line that chilled everyone who read it. "I never stole from the living, only from those who had already been forgotten." Norman justified his embezzlement as a redistribution of inertia, money sitting idle, growing no interest, claimed by no heirs, held by institutions with no memory. He wrote, "The dead had no need for decimal points. The forgotten had no lawyers. The numbers sat like dust, I gave them music." He framed it as justice. The government called it grand larceny. The ethics debated. Norman's crimes sparked years of debate in financial ethics circles. Some saw him as a fraudster wrapped in art, a manipulator who cloaked crime in culture. Others, like financial historian Dr. Elaine Mertz, argued that Norman's actions exposed the moral vacancy of institutional wealth management. He didn't crack a vault or rob a register. He moved neglected currency through melody. What does it say about our system that it took a jazz musician to notice how dead our money had become? To this day, the Royce problem is taught in ethics courses. Is it theft if the victim doesn't know, care, or exist anymore? The woman in the photograph. In 2012, Jessa Lane received a package in the mail. No return address. Inside was a black and white photograph of a woman playing trumpet on a city street. Early morning light, soft shadows. The woman was Jessa taken without her knowledge, nearly 10 years earlier. On the back of the photo, written in Norman's familiar script, "You listened. You heard the rest between the lies. Thank you." A ledger. Attached was a handwritten solo, 16 measures long, a soft, wavering melody with no key signature, no name. Jessa framed it. She never heard from him again. The Whisper Network. Within the American jazz underground, rumors persist. Musicians whisper about a saxophonist who appears unannounced, plays unaccompanied, and vanishes before the end of the set. They call him Ghost Reed. He's been reportedly spotted in a Berlin basement lounge in 2011, at a closed-door Chicago improvisational round table in 2015, on the banks of the Mississippi during a jazz funeral in 2019. Always older, always quiet, always refusing tips. He never speaks his name, but every venue receives a donation envelope the next day. Inside, crisp bills and a scrap of paper with the phrase, "The books still sing." A saxophone in a locker. In 2020, a Kansas City music conservatory received an anonymous donation. Inside a rusted locker at the train station was a Selmer Mark VI saxophone, a rare, vintage model, expertly maintained. The serial number matched Norman Royce's instrument. There was no note, no name, no camera footage of the drop. Just one slip of paper tucked inside the case. If you hear a minor seventh rise into silence, play it gently. Someone's listening. The saxophone now sits in a glass case in the school's foyer. It is never played. But every Friday evening, a student plays Lush Life in the hallway nearby. Just in case. What he took and what he gave. When the case was officially closed, authorities listed $4.7 million stolen, 46 dummy accounts, 17 shell companies, 6 jazz clubs funded, 2 lawsuits settled anonymously. one fugitive presumed deceased. But that list omits the unmeasurable. Dozens of musicians who played because their venues stayed open. An entire archive of handwritten solos now preserved in jazz libraries. A city that learned how much sound can say, especially when it's saying goodbye. Norman Royce didn't want to be found. He wanted to be heard. Not applauded. Just understood. VIII, a new generation of listeners. Jessa Lane eventually started a foundation, the Royce Rest Initiative. Its goal: fund music education and financial literacy in underprivileged communities. Every scholarship recipient receives a packet containing a solo Norman wrote, a copy of The Ethics of Quiet Theft, and a note from Jessa herself which reads, "Use your voice, but know where every note comes from." IX, the last entry in the real ledger. In 2021, during a digitization project at Midwest Consolidated Trust and Surety, archivists uncovered a single paper ledger in a mislabeled box. It contained transactions from 2001. Only one entry was handwritten. It read, "Client Greenbrier Family Trust. Amount $0. Status account settled. Notes they forgot but I remembered. Initials NR." It was the only entry in the book. The rest of the pages were blank. X the music between the lines. Norman Royce built a symphony from silence. He never wanted applause. He never asked forgiveness. And whether you call him thief, artist, criminal, or poet, he did what few ever dare to do. He rewrote the ending to other people's stories. Not with words, with arrests, with ledger lines, with music no one else could hear until he left the room. And somewhere, maybe, that music still plays. Softly, unaccompanied, forever unresolved. Detective Mail Story 5, The Cold Case in Room 216. The hotel with no guests. The Bridalhurst Inn had long outlived its glamour. Built in 1911 on the outskirts of Erie, Pennsylvania, it had once been a destination for steel magnates, opera stars, and politicians passing through the Rust Belt. But by the 1980s, it was mostly a ghost. Old pipes, yellowed wallpaper, and an elevator that groaned like it hated its job. The staff kept it clean but not modern. Cheap rooms, cheap coffee. Mostly rented by traveling salespeople, truckers, and the occasional drifter looking for shelter and anonymity. And on one cold January morning in 1992, someone checked into room 216. And never checked out. The discovery. It wasn't unusual for guests to overstay their booking. The night clerk, Maureen Keller, assumed the guest had slipped out early. The key was still in the lock from the inside. No noise, no request for towels. She knocked. No answer. She unlocked the door and paused. No body. No luggage. Just a bed that looked perfectly made, yet slightly disturbed. A faint smell of burnt wax, a single glass on the nightstand, and an opened Gideon Bible turned to Revelation 21. And there shall be no more death, neither sorrow nor crying. And sitting on the desk was a note, unsigned, written in neat capital letters. I was never here. The missing guest. The hotel's check-in ledger showed a single entry for room 216, dated January 11, 1992. The name Daniel Voss. No address listed. Paid in cash $72 for 2 nights. No phone number. No ID was copied. Nothing unusual at the time. When police ran the name, they found nothing. No Daniel Voss matching the physical description: white male, early 40s, 61, blue eyes, brown hair, in the DMV, Social Security, or National Missing Persons database. No one was looking for him. There were no fingerprints. Even the glass had been wiped clean. The only trace he left behind was the note and a small brass key left in the drawer. It wasn't the hotel key. It had no tags, and it didn't open anything in the room. The case that refused to be solved. Detective Ruth Donnelly, 34 at the time, was assigned to the case. She'd handled disappearances before, but usually they involved chaos, not precision. This one unnerved her. He wanted us to know he'd been there, she later said, but also that he hadn't. Her investigation turned up nothing. No one came forward. No nearby witnesses recalled a man matching the description. Surveillance was spotty, and the front desk camera had been broken for months. And then there was the key. The brass key in the warehouse. 6 months after the room incident, Ruth received an anonymous envelope. No return address. Inside, a black and white photograph of a storage warehouse with a unit circled in red ink. No message, just the photo. Ruth followed the lead. The warehouse was located 40 minutes outside of town in a defunct industrial park, Unit 419. The brass key from room 216 fit perfectly. Inside the unit, a single folding chair, a rolled-up map of Erie from 1958, a copy of The Stranger by Albert Camus, and an old briefcase. The briefcase was locked, and the key didn't fit. The second key in the typewriter. In 1994, nearly 2 years later, the Bridlehurst Inn called the police again. Another room, this time room 104, had been found in a similar state. Nothing missing, nothing stolen. No one seen coming or going. A faint smell of wax. A glass of water untouched. And on the desk, a different note. Typed this time. Again, I was never here. No one had rented the room. The logbook had no entry. But tucked into the Bible, once again open to Revelation 21, was a different brass key. This one had the number E4 etched onto the shaft. Ruth didn't know it then, but she was chasing a man who had made erasure an art form. The motel connection. By 1996, Ruth had discovered 5 other cases across the state with similar details. A quiet hotel room. No confirmed guest. No body. A note indicating absence. And always a key. None of the keys matched each other. Different styles, different shapes, but each was found in a Bible open to the same passage. At one location, an assistant manager recalled a guest asking, "Do you think people remember places where nothing happened?" He couldn't recall the man's face. A pattern forms. Between 1992 and 1998, Ruth compiled a list of 11 unsolved incidents. Each involved a hotel, a room with no confirmed guest, and a missing person who had never officially existed. She began to believe this wasn't a disappearance. It was a campaign. Someone was leaving behind absences not for crime, not for art, but for a reason she couldn't yet see. The break-in at Ruth's apartment. In October 1998, Ruth came home to find her apartment door slightly ajar. Nothing was stolen, but on her kitchen table was a small item that hadn't been there before. A Gideon Bible, open to Revelation 21. And between the pages, a photo. A candid shot of Ruth taken months earlier, walking her dog in a park. On the back, a typed note. "People remember you, that's your weakness." And then it stopped. After the apartment incident, the trail went cold. No new rooms. No new notes. No new keys. By 2001, Ruth was reassigned. She kept the files, but her department labeled the case inactive. She never stopped wondering about who he was, about why he chose rooms instead of bodies, about the brass keys, silent objects to nowhere, and about why Revelation 21, A passage about the end of suffering kept appearing where no suffering had been seen. Keys with no doors. For years, Detective Ruth Donnelly kept the brass keys on a corkboard in her home office. Labeled by date and location, they were the only physical artifacts she could hold onto. The keys varied in size and cut, some older, some looking newly minted, but none matched any lock on file. She once brought them to the Erie Police Department's evidence room technician, who said, "These aren't blanks, they're specific, but not for any standard brand." A second opinion from a private locksmith in Philadelphia finally produced a breakthrough. One of the keys had an engraving so faint it required ultraviolet light to see it. It read, "DVOSS Box 14B Narrows." The locksmith paused. Narrows, that might be Narrowsburg upstate. Aye, the Narrowsburg box. Narrowsburg, New York, was the kind of place you pass on the way to somewhere else. Forest, fog, and fishing. Ruth drove up that weekend, clutching the key like it might vanish. She found a self-storage facility off Route 97. The place looked abandoned, moss-covered fencing, chain-link gates hanging askew, but one section had newer padlocks. And there it was. Box 14B. The key clicked easily. Inside, a vintage Olympia typewriter. A binder labeled "Occupants of Room 216." A single cassette tape. A stained map of Pennsylvania, dotted with red stars. And another key, this one etched with 216. Ruth's breath caught. He had a room key, for a room no one was supposed to have. The binder, an accounting of absences. Inside the binder were 24 hand-typed pages, each listing a name, a date, and the phrase "Room 216." Every name was someone never reported missing. Ruth cross-referenced public records, obituaries, DMV files. The pattern was chilling. Each person had been recently divorced, suffering from financial or health distress, unattached, no children or close family, and each had disappeared within a week of checking into an inn or motel. But here was the twist. They had all checked in under aliases. The name Daniel Voss was used 4 times. But so were Henry Lowes, Marlon Vane, C. DeWitt, just initials like JR or TM. It wasn't just one person doing the vanishing. It might have been many. The tape, the voice. Ruth had the cassette digitized. The voice was male, mid-40s, unaccented American English. Calm, measured, like reading a eulogy. There are places you go when you want to be forgotten, but forgetting is not a passive act. It's a deal. You give up your name, your story, your absence. In return, you get silence. The tape continued for 11 minutes, part monologue, part manifesto. The room is not magic, it's not haunted, it's a container for who you were before you stopped being seen. Near the end, he added, "Some come to vanish, some come to watch. One of us is always in room 216. Ruth played it again. And again. The last line made her feel like she was being watched. "If you're listening, you're too late." The map and the stars. The stained map of Pennsylvania had 13 red stars, all clustered around small towns and rest stops. Ruth plotted each one against archived hotel listings. 9 matched existing inns that had since closed. 2 were now demolished. 1 was still open, a rural lodge in Lycoming County called Hunter's Glen Retreat. And 1 directly beneath the final star had never been listed on any official registry. It was simply marked The Crossing. The coordinates led to a now-defunct railroad depot turned private residence. She wondered, was the crossing the beginning or the end? Hunter's Glen, the visitor log. Ruth visited Hunter's Glen under the guise of a travel writer. The innkeeper, a woman named Corrine, had run the place since 1985. When Ruth asked about Daniel Voss, Corrine's eyes narrowed. "We had a Mr. Voss, quiet man, smelled like wax and cedar, stayed 2 nights, left no trace. That was, early '93. Corrine checked the old guest ledger. There he was, VOSSD, room 216. The lodge had only 12 rooms. There was no room 216. Corrine flipped the book. A small margin note had been scribbled next to the name. Key left in Bible. VII, the other side of the mirror. As Ruth dug deeper, she found another pattern. In each town where a Voss incident occurred, someone else disappeared within 48 hours. But these were not lonely or lost people. These were local figures, librarians, teachers, bus drivers, people who had a life. And they disappeared with no alias, no record of checking in, no family left behind. But a few had something strange in common. They had once stayed at a hotel with a room 216. One man had been a bellhop at the Bridalhurst Inn in the 80s. Another had been a janitor at a highway motel with a room 216. It was as if the room didn't just erase people, it somehow traded them. VII, Ruth's hypothesis. She built a theory that stretched the definition of criminal logic. There is a person or a group using room 216 as a controlled threshold. One person disappears, another is selected to vanish. The room isn't haunted, it's curated. It sounded insane, until she realized each disappearance was preceded by the same clue. A note, always typed, always brief, always saying the same thing. I was never here. And always accompanied by a key. IX, the final visit. Ruth returned to the Bridalhurst Inn. It was 2003, 11 years since it all began. She booked room 216. The wallpaper was peeling now, the ceiling tiles bowed, but the desk was still there, the bed, the lamp. She sat on the edge of the mattress for hours, waiting. Nothing. Then, sometime past midnight, she woke up. The lamp was off. She hadn't turned it off. And on the nightstand, a brass key, one she hadn't brought, engraved simply with RD. No note, no sound, no sign of entry. Just the key. X, the pause before the vanish. Ruth didn't report it. She kept the key, pinned it to the center of her corkboard, a silent eye watching the others. She never checked into room 216 again. But she never stopped watching the records. And every few years, the pattern resurfaces. A guest who doesn't exist. A note with no fingerprints. A key that fits nowhere. And a name on a registry that doesn't belong there. It's not a haunting. It's not a murder. It's a pattern of silence. And the question remains, if a person disappears with intention and leaves only a key, do they still exist somewhere else? The archivist's discovery. In 2010, Angela Hollow, a junior archivist with the Pennsylvania Historical Society, was reviewing municipal zoning maps from the 1940s when she found something strange. A blueprint for a hotel named the Crossing Inn. According to the plans, it had 22 rooms, but room 216 appeared twice. 2 different locations, same number. Angela brought it up at a staff meeting, jokingly. But one of the older archivists, a man named Lawrence Boone, didn't laugh. He said, "Room 216's not a room, it's a doorway, always has been." When pressed, he only said, "People don't check in, they check out of being known." Angela filed it under urban folklore. But the blueprint stayed with her. Because room 216 wasn't just duplicated. It was drawn without walls. The janitor's notebook. A decade earlier, in 2000, a janitor named Miles Rennick, who worked at the Bridalhurst Inn, died of a stroke in his home. His niece, going through his things, found a notebook labeled "Invisible Guests." Inside were careful records of strange incidents at the hotel. Unbooked rooms found disturbed, keys appearing on beds, cold spots in hallways during heat waves, Bibles left open to Revelation 21, even when none were placed in the room. One entry from 1993 stood out. Room 216 silent all night, then noise like breathing not mine. Woke up at 2:16 a.m., key on floor, no one there. It was the only note with a time. 2:16 a.m. A pattern in time. Detective Ruth Donnelly cross-referenced every known Room 216 disappearance. She discovered that in every case, the room had been accessed, either entered, cleaned, or found disturbed between 2:14 and 2:18 a.m. Each time, the only evidence left behind was a note, a key, a Bible, a glass of water, the scent of wax. Even in the cases that occurred before the Bridalhurst Inn existed, the logs where available mentioned 2:16 a.m. as a time of last known presence. One elderly motel owner remembered a man checking in real quiet, real late, round 2:15. He didn't remember the man's face, but he remembered the room, 216. Always 216. The tapes in the wall. In 2012, Bridalhurst Inn underwent minor renovations. During a wall removal near room 216, workers found a bundle of cassette tapes sealed inside the drywall, wrapped in wax paper and bound with twine. Each tape was labeled with a date, spanning from 1987 to 2001. On the tapes were voice logs, calm, male, the same voice from the Narrowsburg cassette Ruth had found. Except these weren't philosophical musings. They were observations. Room 216. Guest checked in under C. DeWitt. Thin, nervous, stayed silent. At 2:16 a.m. they vanished. No noise, no scent, just silence, then absence. Room holds memory, but memory is passive. I record so others forget. Ruth had them analyzed. The tapes were real. And the voice still hasn't been matched to any known person. The anonymous letter. That same year, Ruth received a letter with no return address. It was typed like the others. But this one said something different. You are the only one who sees the pattern. That makes you dangerous. Room 216 is not a place. It's a threshold. Keep asking where it leads. But ask yourself who built it first. Inside the envelope was a single key. This one was clear glass. No grooves, no metal. It couldn't open anything. But when held to the light, a faint 216 shimmered inside. The vanishing of Ruth Donnelly. On February 16, 2016, Ruth checked into a small hotel in Cold Hollow, Vermont under the name M. Vane. Security footage shows her entering the building at 10:37 p.m. She was never seen leaving. The cleaning staff entered the room at 11:05 the next morning. The bed was made. Bible open to Revelation 21. Glass of water untouched. A single note on the desk. I saw the pattern. I heard the silence. I went through the door. RD. On the pillow was her badge. And a clear glass key. The ghost check-ins. Since Ruth's disappearance, similar events have been reported sporadically across the U.S. and Canada. A man disappears from a cabin in British Columbia, room 216, no record of arrival. A woman in Montana checks into a motor lodge under a false name, leaves a key made of bone. A guest in Missouri asks for room 216, even though the hotel has no such room. They vanish anyway. Each event follows the same structure. 2:16 a.m. A note. A key. A sense that someone wanted very badly to become no one. And in some cases, someone new disappears shortly after. Someone not lost but taken. VIII, the working theory. Modern folklore researchers and cold case investigators now refer to room 216 as a soft myth, a story that replicates itself through coincidence and architectural memory. A kind of non-haunting haunting. A voluntary exile masquerading as supernatural absence. Some believe room 216 is a metaphor used by those who seek to escape reality. Others believe it's part of a secret program for witness protection gone rogue. But the most accepted underground theory, attributed to former FBI profiler Tobias Crane, is chilling. Room 216 is real, but not physical. It's a set of instructions. You bring the pieces, the Bible, the note, the key. You check in. You follow the script. You are replaced. IX, the truth that stays behind. Hotels across the country have quietly removed room 216 from their numbering systems. They skip from 215 to 217. Staff are instructed to deny any knowledge of the room. But every so often, a front desk manager reports a strange guest who insists, "I've been there before, I just need my key." They usually leave without issue. But in the following days, someone else is reported missing. Someone who never knew what room 216 was. But apparently, someone else decided they'd be a good trade. Reflection, when silence speaks back. The cold case of room 216 remains unsolved. It has no crime scene, no murderer, no motive, just patterns, keys, Bibles, notes, absences, and the people who go looking for it often end up gone. But there is one lingering truth. If you seek to disappear completely, room 216 is waiting. If you simply forget, room 216 may find you anyway. And the next time you check into a quiet motel on the outskirts of nowhere, if the room smells faintly of wax, if the Bible's already open, if there's a key on the desk and no number on the door, ask yourself, did you find room 216 or did it find you? Detective Mail Story 6, The Taxidermist of Green Hollow. A small town that forgot to wake up. Green Hollow, Michigan, wasn't a town you drove through on your way to anywhere else. Hidden between stretches of old-growth pine, it was the kind of place that stayed small not because it was quiet, but because it wanted to be. By 1997, it had fewer than 400 residents, a single diner, one stop sign, a gas station that closed at 5. Even the church bell had long since gone silent. And tucked behind an overgrown hedgerow, just outside town limits, stood McGreevy's Taxidermy, a weathered brick building that looked more like a mausoleum than a storefront. No neon signs, no advertising. But nearly every hunter in the Upper Peninsula knew, if you wanted your trophy preserved with soul, you went to McGreevy. What they didn't know was what he was preserving in the basement. The man behind the glass eyes. Wallace McGreevy was a mystery wrapped in a camouflage vest. In his late 60s, by the late 90s, he walked with a limp and spoke in clipped syllables. Rumor had it he'd served in Vietnam, though no one ever saw his discharge papers. He lived alone, never married, never missed Sunday morning coffee at Louise's diner. Locals described him as polite, not friendly, and the kind of man who trims his hedges with a measuring stick. Inside his shop, things were eerie. Birds mid-flight, glass-eyed deer heads, raccoons posed like butlers. He didn't do pets, he didn't do special requests. But once a year, like clockwork, McGreevy closed the shop for a week in early September. He told people he went fishing, but his neighbors never saw him leave. The smell that wouldn't go away. In the fall of 1998, local teenager Eli Devane was caught breaking into McGreevy's shop on a dare. Sheriff's Deputy Leslie Brandt responded to the call. She expected a case of trespassing. What she found was a pale, shaking boy who refused to speak for nearly 2 hours. All Eli said was, "There's something under the floor." At first, no one took it seriously, but Deputy Brandt couldn't ignore the odd detail, a persistent odor like ammonia and old meat seeping from the back hallway. She convinced the sheriff to authorize a quiet inspection. And what they found behind a locked trapdoor in the back of the shop would shake Green Hollow to its roots. The basement collection. The trapdoor led to a narrow, handmade staircase, dust thick enough to choke. A single light bulb swung on a cord. What the officers found below: a concrete room lined with floor-to-ceiling glass cases. Inside each case, a taxidermied human figure posed and dressed. 13 in total, each with glass eyes, some too bright, some too lifelike. Each tagged with a small brass plate, first name only. There were no signs of trauma, no signs of embalming. Each figure looked, preserved somehow, natural, peaceful. Too peaceful. The town reacts and denies. Wallace McGreevy was arrested that night without incident. He said only one thing as he was placed in the back of the cruiser: "They told me they wanted to stay." News spread quickly. Some residents refused to believe it. Others claimed they'd always suspected something was off. But within days, the county police had cordoned off the property, forensic teams had arrived from Lansing, and Green Hollow became the subject of a quiet FBI inquiry. Reporters never got the full story. The cases were sealed, literally. And Green Hollow predictably shut its mouth. Who were they? Forensics revealed a staggering truth. Of the 13 human remains found in the basement, none were listed as missing persons. 7 were women. 5 were men. 1 was undetermined. Ages ranged from 25 to 50. Time of death, estimated between 1973 and 1995. The bodies had been taxidermied, but not with traditional methods. No formaldehyde, no sawdust, no wire frames. Instead, internal organs had been meticulously removed and replaced with a wax resin compound, laced with pine oil and powdered glass. The process was unlike anything known. And no fingerprints, dental records, or DNA matched any known database. They were by all legal means invisible people. The names on the tags. Each display case had a brass tag, etched by hand. Names included Maribel, Amos, Tessa, Lorne, Edith, Charlie, Gabriel. Each name was common, untraceable. Ruth Donnelly, yes, that Ruth Donnelly reviewed the case in 2005, years after her Room 216 investigation. She noticed something that chilled her. Every name was also a name of a child who had disappeared from the foster system in the 60s and 70s. No photos existed, no family claims, but the timelines fit. Ruth called them the vanished children. But they were all adults when found, which meant someone had helped them disappear long before McGreevy preserved them. McGreevy's silence. Wallace McGreevy never testified. At trial, he sat silent, eyes open, unblinking. His defense team argued mental illness, citing a possible frontal lobe injury from his war years. But no medical evidence supported it. The judge ordered psychiatric evaluation. Forensic psychologists reported that McGreevy was competent, aware, and articulate but unwilling. They recorded a single statement he made during a session. "Some people are meant to be forgotten. I just made it comfortable." He died in 2003 of a heart attack in a state facility. No last words, no will. Just a storage unit key, mailed anonymously to the Green Hollow town clerk. IX the storage unit. Inside the storage unit, a journal, entries dated from 1969 to 1997. Hundreds of Polaroids of unidentified people, mostly smiling. Receipts for preserved chemicals, glass eyes, and wax resin. A sketch of a machine labeled Still Form Frame 4. The journal was methodical. Entries described encounters. Marable found at rest stop, said she had no name, gave her one, she smiled. Lauren asked to stay longer this time, didn't want to be raw anymore, prepped him. He closed his eyes himself. Tessa didn't want to be remembered as broken, said she wanted to pause. I said okay. It wasn't killing. Not murder. Not in his eyes. It was preservation. A kindness. A taxidermy of the forgotten. The quiet horror. Of all the horrors in Green Hollow's history, none shook the foundations quite like the taxidermist's collection. No screams, no blood, no chains. Just silence, wax, and names whispered through brass tags. The figures were eventually buried, anonymously, in the woods near a trail now known unofficially as Stillform Path. The shop was razed. The land left empty. But hikers say on quiet autumn mornings, when the fog is thick and the birds go still, you can hear something underneath the soil. Not voices, but breathing. The journal that shouldn't exist. When the Green Hollow town clerk opened the anonymous envelope, she didn't expect to find a storage key, much less the remnants of a hidden history. The journal found inside the unit, dubbed the Stillform Journal, became the centerpiece of a quiet federal review. It had over 300 pages of entries written in dense, orderly cursive. There were no dates, only seasons and years. Winter, 74, she said her name was Lily, but I think that's what she wanted to be called, not what she was born with. She didn't care about dying, just about being remembered the wrong way. Each entry documented an arrival and a preparation. But what caught the attention of investigators was the utter absence of force. Each subject, according to McGreevy, came willingly. A hidden network. As analysts combed through the Stillform Journal, one repeating detail emerged. In several entries, McGreevy referenced someone named Tobias, often referred to simply as the courier. Example entries. Tobias brought a new one, said she wanted quiet more than company. The courier says another will arrive by dusk, told him to wait till after the storm. The language was passive, almost ritualistic. Authorities began to wonder, was McGreevy part of a larger system? A network not of traffickers, but of obscurers, people who specialized in helping those on the very edge of society disappear by design. A kind of black market for intentional erasure. The courier identified. In 2014, retired FBI agent Lorraine Keene reopened the case as part of a cold case training workshop. Her team traced Tobias to a Tobias E. McNair, a former social worker from Milwaukee who disappeared in 1989 after allegations of misconduct in foster placement. A surviving photo showed a tall, thin man with thick-rimmed glasses and a sad smile. No charges were ever filed. But 3 of the children he had worked with had also vanished within 5 years. No records, no transfers, just gone. One was named Edith, another Gabriel, both names etched in McGreevy's glass coffins. The Ethics of Disappearance. A classified memo from the Michigan Bureau of Investigation circulated quietly among forensic psychologists. If the subjects were indeed willing and no harm was done against their will, are these acts murder or assisted identity erasure? One criminologist proposed a term: consensual objectification, the process of intentionally removing oneself from society and being converted into an object of silence. It raised deep questions. Did these people consent to their fate? Or were they coerced by despair? Can someone truly consent to becoming a display? And most haunting of all, were they seeking death or a new kind of immortality? The McGreevy technique. A forensic pathologist from Wayne State University led the analysis of McGreevy's preservation method. She reported no traces of standard embalming agents, a custom blend of tree resin, pine pitch, and powdered glass, internal organs replaced with molded wax forms, use of insect-repelling herbs inside cranial cavities, precise stitching using fishing line. But one detail defied logic. The skin on each preserved figure remained soft, uncracked, and unshrinking, even years after recovery. It was as if they had paused in time, not preserved, but held in suspension. The term still form became an internal classification code. An eyewitness from the edge. In 2016, a woman named Clara Mayers came forward after watching a regional documentary about the Green Hollow case. She was living in Oregon under a different name and claimed to be the sister of Marable, one of the figures found in McGreevy's basement. She said Marable had run away from a group home in 1972 and was never seen again. But she recalled something chilling. She used to talk about wanting to stop, just stop being alive but not die. She'd say, "I want to become background." Clara didn't know what that meant until she saw the photo of the brass nameplate. She burst into tears when she saw the handwriting. "That's her. That's how she wrote our names when we were kids." The secret visitors. Records show that over a span of 24 years, McGreevy received at least 19 undocumented visits after hours. This was corroborated by utility logs and circuit breaker records. Brief but consistent power usage between 11 p.m. and 3 a.m., during times when the shop was supposedly closed. In 1991, a delivery driver claimed to have dropped off a girl in a suitcase at the shop just before midnight. No one ever reported her missing. No name, no search. It was like she had simply drifted off the map. The uncatalogued figure. Among the 13 confirmed figures found in the basement, a 14th was referenced in the journal, but never found. McGreevy referred to the individual only as Echo. Repeated entries describe the preparation. She didn't want to be seen. I asked how she'd like to be remembered. She said, only in outline. Investigators theorized the figure was destroyed prior to McGreevy's arrest, or perhaps relocated. But others believe Echo never became a figure. She became something else. In the last entry in the Stillform Journal, McGreevy writes, "Echo remained. She watches the others. She is the reminder, not of death but of stillness." The children of Stillform. Ruth Donnelly's archived notes included an unconfirmed lead, a missing foster family file from 1976, containing records of 5 children placed into unofficial care by a private intermediary. The file, labeled, listed all 5 children as relocated out of state. 2 names match McGreevy's brass tags. But the others, still missing, still unclaimed. It's believed that McGreevy and Tobias McNair may have used private placement networks, a now-defunct, poorly regulated system that left dozens of children untracked through the 1970s. Green Hollow, in its silence, had possibly served as the final address for those unwanted anywhere else. A-Town complicit. some residents began to talk quietly, carefully. One former diner waitress remembered men in dark suits visiting McGreevy late at night. A former mailman said packages from Northern Pines Social Services came monthly but were never sent back. And a retired sheriff's deputy admitted under sealed testimony. "We knew he was odd, but we thought he was keeping to himself. Never heard a scream, never saw a struggle, but I did see the van every September. A battered white van with no plates. Parked at McGreevy, always on a Wednesday. Always gone by morning." XI. Reflections from the forensics room. Dr. Melissa Tran, lead forensic anthropologist for the case, later wrote in a private paper, "McGreevy did not kill, he suspended. The moral line he crossed is not one of violence but of consent. He was not playing God, he was playing archivist." She concluded her paper with a question. Is it murder to make someone into memory? The vanishing years. From 1973 to 1995, at least 13 individuals were preserved and arranged by Wallace McGreevy in the hidden basement of his taxidermy shop. But how many others had come and gone, never cataloged, never found? Forensic gaps suggested unexplained absences entries in the still-form journal that did not correspond to any recovered figure. Phrases like, "didn't stay, moved on," "chose the forest," "asked to be scattered." These suggested alternative fates. Perhaps some changed their minds. Perhaps some were never real to begin with. Or worse, perhaps some were part of a process yet undiscovered. Echo's trace. Though the figure dubbed Echo was never found, investigators uncovered scraps of fabric, coated in resin and pine oil, buried behind McGreevy's property beneath a patch of moss and birch. The composition matched the preservation blend used in the known still-form subjects. Yet there was no body. Only fabric folded carefully, weighted with stones. As if the person had shed themselves like skin, then walked away. Some believed Echo never intended to stay. She came to observe, to understand, and left, leaving only her outline behind. The secret tape. A cassette tape was recovered from McGreevy's residence, mislabeled as Mallard's 85. Hidden among a pile of nature recordings, it contained a 40-minute spoken confession not addressed to police, but to Tobias. On the tape, McGreevy speaks calmly. "I don't think they understood what I was doing at first, but they came anyway. They always came." He describes a sense of responsibility, of holding the lost still so they wouldn't disappear altogether. He says, "They didn't want a second chance, just a moment held." The final lines said quietly off mic. "They don't scream in the dark, they whisper, and when the lights go out I still hear them say thank you." The still-form frame. Among the items in McGreevy's storage unit was a strange sketch design labeled Still-Form Frame 4. It appeared to be a partial metal key, with braces for arms, neck, and spine, and a curvature intended to hold posture. But this was not for restraint. It was for presentation. Like a sculptor's mold. Investigators believe this was how McGreevy maintained lifelike poses. The design was crude, but effective. But what unnerved forensic engineers was that it bore resemblance to theatrical rigging systems used in funerary displays in pre-WWII Europe. McGreevy had reimagined mourning as performance. The one that escaped. In 2007, a hospice nurse in Portland, Oregon filed an unusual report. A patient named Catherine Lorne had passed peacefully, leaving behind no known family. Among her belongings, a brass tag with the name LORNE etched in script. The same name as one of the figures in Green Hollow. But here's the twist. This Catherine had scars along her torso, consistent with post-mortem organ removal and stitching identical to McGreevy's methods. Yet she was alive until 2007. Was she mistaken for dead? Did McGreevy's process fail? Or had she reanimated her identity, escaping before full completion? Her hospice notes included one cryptic line. "I told him I changed my mind. He said then leave quietly, and I did." VI Tobias returns. In 2019, a man matching Tobias McNair's description was spotted in Spokane, Washington. He was older, gaunt, using a cane. A reporter confronted him outside a library, asking if he was the courier. The man simply replied, "I was a librarian of sorts. I shelved stories that didn't want to be read anymore." No official ID, no address. He vanished 2 days later. But on the library's lost and found desk, someone left behind a handwritten list. Tessa, Amos, Edith, Gabriel, Maribel, Lauren, Charlie, Echo, Tobias. Each name crossed out except the last. VII, the Garden of Stillness. The 13 confirmed stillform figures were interred in a specially commissioned memorial, site the Garden of Stillness on protected state forest land near Green Hollow. Each marker bore only a first name and the inscription, "You asked to be remembered in quiet." The local government refused to issue full death certificates. The case remains technically unsolved. Not a murder, not a missing persons incident, but a consensual vanishing. VII, public memory and forgetting. Years later, the McGreevy case is rarely taught in criminology courses. Too ambiguous, too morally gray, too silent. But among cold case investigators, it's become a kind of litmus test. If a detective brings up stillform and says, "That wasn't a crime," they're watched more closely. And if they say, "I think I understand why they did it," they're removed from the case. Because the stillform files aren't about guilt. They're about thresholds between loneliness and surrender, between hiding and vanishing, between a person and a memory. IX, final entry from Ruth Donnelly. Before retiring in 2022, Ruth Donnelly wrote a private journal entry about McGreevy. It was never published, but obtained through FOIA request. She wrote, "I've seen killers, I've seen monsters, I've seen good people do bad things, but McGreevy was none of those. He was a listener. The world tells some people they're unwanted. McGreevy didn't fight that. He framed it, froze it, said, 'Then let's make you still.' It's hard to say what's more tragic, his method, or the fact that so many wanted it." The mirror room. One final discovery was made during renovations of McGreevy's raised shop site. Construction crews found a hidden wall cavity behind what was once his back office. Inside was a small room, lined entirely with mirrors, walls, floor, and ceiling. At its center, a wooden stool and a glass cabinet door leaning against the wall. No markings, no tags, no tools. Just a single note, taped to the underside of the stool. "For the one who forgets themselves next." The room was removed and relocated to a secure state evidence archive. They called it the mirror room. To date, it remains sealed.